Good morning. It is great to see each of you here today, and if you're visiting with us, we really want to thank you for being here and look forward to getting to spend some time talking with you. By the way, if you're visiting and you're wondering, as sometimes people do, what's up with these cans up here, let me just remind you that we have something called the Brown Bag of Columbus, where we collect an item each month, and that goes to help people that are in need. So I've thought about getting a can opener, in case, but I'll leave those there for now. We appreciate so much the prayers as this last week we got to welcome this guy into the world, and you see Silas there as well, but we're really happy and thankful that everything went well with Caleb's arrival and everything, so appreciate the prayers and the many Amazon packages also that have showed up at our house. I think I owe at least a couple people an apology because I took some of the boxes, we just every day, the UPS and FedEx people are best friends with us, but we ordering different things, and I stacked some up, and the other day we opened one. It was a gift from somebody, and I don't know how long it had been sitting in the garage, but anyway, thank you for all the support and the kind words and texts and prayers and things like that. Before I was so rudely interrupted, okay? We were talking about learning to live the Jesus way 2 weeks ago, and appreciate Noah for his message last week about discipleship related to our theme. But we're talking about this idea that life as a disciple of Jesus, as a follower of Jesus, life as a Christian is centered on this idea represented in this word that's used, hundreds of times in the New Testament, this idea of being a follower, a learner, an apprentice to Jesus, as one of the ways that we might think about what it means to live according to our faith. Now, last week, not last week, but 2 weeks ago, the message about being an apprentice, being someone who is being shaped by life with Jesus and who is learning to follow and imitate Jesus and all of that, in a way, maybe that sounds like a really high bar. Maybe that sounds like some people, unfortunately, refer to people that call themselves as a disciple or use that kind of language. They kind of have this distinction in their mind of like, there's Christians and then there's like disciples. There's Christians here. That's most people. But then there's like the really good Christians or the saints or whatever. There's the real disciples over here. And really, if you read the New Testament, we're all called to be disciples, all called to be followers, learners, apprentices under Jesus, and that's a high standard, right? That means that my life is about walking every day with Jesus and learning to live as He lived, to think as He thought, to speak as He spoke. That's a really high standard for me. At the same time, what I want to say is that the standard doesn't lower. But the gospel comes with abundant grace for our journey. So last time I was up here, the idea was not to say, start being an apprentice of Jesus. That's not it at all. It's to remind us of really what the goal of our faith is, what our orientation of our heart should be focused on, which is this idea of living with Jesus and following the Jesus way. In fact, one of the ways that Christianity is described in the book of Acts is as the way, right? Jesus calls Himself the only person who can provide access to the way, but in the book of Acts, the early church, they were calling themselves followers of the way that Jesus laid out for them and that Jesus provided as He Himself was the way. So the idea is, however imperfect we are, think about this, the word apprentice implies that we are imperfect. I would be a master, not an apprentice, if I had already arrived at what my ultimate final state was going to be, right? You have an apprentice and you have a master. The master is a person who's teaching someone how to do something because they already know what they're doing. The apprentice is somebody who's learning because they don't know what they're doing. And in the New Testament, we're described as being disciples or apprentices. We're people that we don't know what we're doing, but we're learning and we're growing. So the idea of this image or metaphor is that we're all going to be imperfect, but we can make progress in following Jesus. There is a difference, in other words, between someone who has this goal as their heart's fundamental desire and regularly stumbles and falls in the process, and someone who perhaps joins a social club called church and is glad to receive the occasional helpful comment and a pat on the back. And so the question really that we're asking today is, how do I grow as an apprentice to Jesus? How do I make positive steps in becoming more like Jesus? And I'd like to give you an answer that is, on the one hand, going to prove fairly difficult, and yet on the other hand is incredibly simple, so simple that I can give it to you on this same slide, which is, how do I grow as an apprentice of Jesus? The first answer is by faith. By faith. I'd like to really explain what we mean by that. Faith, according to Hebrews 11, verse 6, is like the fundamental, most important thing that we can possibly have. It is the only way, according to this verse, that we can please God. Without faith, it is impossible to please Him. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that He exists and that He rewards those who seek Him. In other words, if somebody has faith, they believe in God's existence, but they also believe that God interacts with human beings in a relational way, that there's a relationship to be had there, and that by being close to God, it leads to a better outcome, right? And that we can have this relationship with God. So, but the question I want to ask is, what does he have in mind here in chapter 11, verse 6, when he talks about this idea of faith? Now, you could go back to the beginning and you could read as the Hebrews writer talks about faith as the assurance of things hoped for, the substance of things not seen. But in Hebrews chapter 11, the writer talks a lot about faith. And as you know, probably from other sermons, people sometimes talk about Hebrews 11 as kind of a catalog of faith, right? By faith Noah, by faith Abram, by faith Rahab, by faith. All of these people are listed for their deeds that they did by faith. But even though he describes faith as being part of the reason for their action, still we're asking the question, okay, but what exactly does it mean to have the assurance of things hoped for? What does it mean to have access to the substance of things not seen? What does it mean to have something going on in my heart that leads me to act in all kinds of different ways? What exactly are we talking about when we're talking about faith? Now, what's interesting is that Hebrews chapter 12 answers the question, what is faith? And he answers the question, and unfortunately, because we have, chapter divisions and stuff, sometimes we miss how so closely woven these chapters are, making one argument in this case. In Hebrews chapter 12, he says, therefore. So he lists all this catalog of faithful actions and deeds and all of that, and he says, okay, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, all these people of faith, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. That's verse 1. Pay careful attention here. He's saying, okay, on the basis of all of these great examples of faith, your Noahs, your Moseses, all of these people, on the basis of these great examples of faith, get rid of your distractions, sinful or otherwise. Focus on what's really important, persevere, live the life God has called you to live. How, though? How? And he answers it for us in this very next verse. Fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. Some versions say the author and perfecter of faith. And he goes on to talk about Jesus. For the joy set before him, he endured. He despised the shame, sat down at the right hand of God. All of that. But he says, okay, set aside everything. Live the life that God has called you to. How? fix your eyes on Jesus. Fix your eyes on Jesus. In a book from like 1948, I think, a guy named A.W. Tozer wrote a book called The Pursuit of God. And in it, he talks about how faith is associated in Scripture with the idea of looking or beholding or gazing at God. Looking and believing is the connection that he makes, and I'll talk to you about that for just a second. Looking and believing. You remember maybe in John chapter 3 when Jesus is having a conversation with Nicodemus, and he talks to Nicodemus about way back in the past, in the book of Numbers, how the people of Israel had been unfaithful to God, and there were all these serpents that were coming and biting them, and they were dying because of this plague, essentially, that God had brought upon them because of their sin. And God provided for them a solution to the problem. And the solution to the problem was Moses set up a bronze serpent on this pole, and anyone who looked at the serpent, looked at the bronze serpent on the stick or whatever, the pillar, the beam, would be healed. Jesus connects that to his own death in John chapter 3, verse 14. As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, why did he lift up the serpent in the wilderness? So that people would look upon the serpent, right? Look upon this thing and be healed by faith. So must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him may have eternal life. This connection between looking and believing is what prompted Tozer to describe faith as the gaze of a soul upon a saving God. And we'll maybe put that in our own way in just a minute. But how can I begin to be an apprentice under Jesus? I have to learn to live in the presence of Jesus. I have to live in the presence of God. Faith, at its very core, is bringing our heart to the presence of God, right? It's the awareness that God is here, and that God is not just here, but that God relates to me in a saving way. The gaze of a soul upon a saving God. I begin to live in the awareness of the presence of God, to gaze upon God in my heart. That's the idea behind the word contemplation, to live a contemplative life of faith. And it comes from the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians 3:18. I'm not going to go on about this too long because I preached about this not too long ago. But Paul says in this passage, "And we all, who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory, are being transformed into his image, from one degree of glory to the next." Well, that's the ESV, because that's what I memorized it in. Here's the ESV. Instead of contemplating the Lord's glory, they say, "We all with unveiled face beholding the glory of the Lord." Seeing. Not just looking, but really seeing who God is and myself in God's presence. And if you notice in 2 Corinthians 3, Paul says our transformation is directly linked to our seeing God in our hearts. And he says in verse 17, this is from the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. What's he saying? He's saying the more you live in the presence of God, or the awareness of the presence of God, the more freedom you enjoy as a human being. Because to live life in God's presence as God's child is to experience freedom. It's to experience joy. It's to experience peace, right? Like two people can go through the same hardship, but if one person is going through it in the awareness of God's loving presence in their life, they can say what Hebrews will quote quoting from the Psalms, "The Lord is my helper. What will I fear? What can man do to me?" Versus someone who is saying, well, I go to church every Sunday, but doesn't have a constant or a growing in the awareness of the presence of God, and hard things come and say, well, God must not love me then, right? What's happening? There's two different perspectives, right? One person is living in the presence of God, and one person is aware of God, but is not living in the presence of God. So what are we meaning when we're talking about this idea of faith as beholding, if you will? Faith as the heart's gaze upon God and trusting in His saving power. I want to think about this idea. I just said this, that beholding God, we can describe it as living in the awareness of His presence. But I want to put these two things on the slide for you this morning to kind of think about. When we're thinking about faith as beholding, learning to live in the presence of Jesus, I want to give you a couple of suggestions about what this looks like on a daily basis. That, number one, I can learn, it's a practice, right? It's not something that we just flip a switch. It's something we grow into. I can learn to direct my internal dialogue to God in prayer. This is what Paul's talking about in 1 Thessalonians 5 when he says that we should pray without ceasing. How can a person pray without ceasing? Well, you're pretty much talking to yourself without ceasing, aren't you? Maybe when you're concentrated, you kind of lose the awareness of yourself. But all of us talk to ourselves more than any other person. We're in constant inner dialogue with ourselves. That's what our thoughts are. In fact, in ancient languages, some ancient languages, the very concept of thinking is speaking. When someone is thinking by themselves, in the Old Testament, this is definitely true, it'll say, so-and-so said to himself. It doesn't mean that he was literally talking to himself per se. It means he was having a dialogue with himself. He was thinking and talking. We do this all of the time as we go through life. And we can develop a redirecting of that to God. Think about this. Maybe you're stressed about a meeting that is coming up. On the one hand, you could have an inner dialogue that is thinking, I'm really worried about what do I need to think about? How do I figure this out? So they're going to say that, then I'm going to say this. Do I have my note? You could have that dialogue. Or you could have that same dialogue in the presence of God. Lord, I've got this big meeting coming up, and I'm trying to think about the right thing to say, and I'm trying to think if I've got everything prepared. But suddenly, you've gone from having this conversation with yourself, not thinking about the presence of God, to being drawn into the presence of God, to being filled with power and strength from your experience living in the presence of God. That every thought, in a sense, eventually, as we grow in, I'm not at all perfect in this, that's why I started with saying this is a process, right? We're growing in this. But every thought that we have ultimately can be directed to God in prayer. That I can say stuff to myself, or I can say stuff to God. And I can think in the presence of myself, or I can think in the presence of God. And this leads to the second thing, that I can develop an awareness that God is present with me always. This is what David is doing in Psalm 139, by the way, which we'll get to in just a second. But the point is, it's not about going to a monastery and saying, all that there is the presence of God, all that there is. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about how we in our daily life take every thought captive, as Paul says in 2 Corinthians. How we direct our entire being to life in the presence of Jesus. How do you be an apprentice? You got to be with your master. You can't be an apprentice without being with your master. And so what we're really saying is to live by faith is to live in the awareness of the presence of God. I like the way that John Mark Comer put it in one of his books. Hopefully you can read that. If not, I'm going to read it to you. But he says, all of us have a source we are rooted in, a kind of default setting we return to, an emotional home. Now notice this. It's where our minds go when they're not busy with tasks, where our feelings go when we need solace, where our bodies go when we have free time, where our money goes after we pay the bills. What is he saying? He's saying everybody's heart goes somewhere all the time during the day. Have you noticed that, let's say you're at work and you're working on a project, a task, whatever it is. You might be really concentrated for a little while. Nobody's attention span lasts forever though, right? And so you're in a kind of a deep state of thinking about something and you come out of that for a second. Where does your heart go? Where does your mind go? Where do your thoughts go? Do they go to the presence of God? Or do they go to the worries of life? Or do they go to, your hopes and dreams? Do they go toward that conversation you had last week? Listen, when we come out and we find our heart with a moment to come up from air from our work, do we want to take that breath of air in the presence of God? Or do we want to try to get our quick reel in, And listen, I'm not even telling you not to watch a reel ever. You could even watch a reel in the presence of God, right? You could say, Lord, I've got 30 seconds here. I'm just going to relax, and somebody sent this to me. Have a laugh, whatever. But one's in the presence of God and one isn't. This is a subtle thing, and yet it apparently is something that is this super important aspect of what it means to be a person who lives by faith. Did you notice that all those people in Hebrews 11, it's their actions that are by faith, by faith, by faith, by faith. Faith is seeing, and yet faith is doing. Why? Because faith sees oneself in the presence of God in all that a person does, in all of my life, in all of my actions. So as an apprentice of Jesus, I am trying to, and you are trying to, redirect our heart over and over again back to God and to bring God really in a way into my daily life. In a way could describe this as processing life with God, right? I can process life in my own mind, or I can process life in the presence of God. Comer again writes this, in our fast-paced, productivity-obsessed, digitally distracted culture that is endlessly chasing the life script of up and to the right, time is money and money is God. So the idea of slowing down, coming to quiet, dealing with the myriad of distractions within and without, and just letting God love you into a person of love sounds like a waste of time. People have described prayer as wasting time on God, and they don't mean that in a negative way. They're saying what the world sees as a waste of time, I want to spend living in the presence of God. Now, you say all of that is well and good, and I need to move a little bit quicker here. You say all of that is well and good, but I don't always have this warm and fuzzy sense of God's presence in my life, right? Like it's not easy, and you have doubts about living in the presence of God because sometimes we're just not feeling that closeness, right? Like you go to church camp as a kid, you're like, I'm in God's throne room, and then you come home and it's like, I need to go back, right? Because it's hard to have that emotional connection all the time. And so that's why I want to make really clear here that living in the presence of God is not always feeling the presence of God. Living in the presence of God is not always feeling the presence of God. That's why I tried to describe it, and it's not original to me, but I'm trying to describe it as a practice rather than a feeling. It's something that we do, not something that we feel. And very often our feelings will follow our practices, but not always. Sometimes we pray and it's like, I don't really know if God heard that or not, but I'm going to trust that He did. And then other times we pray and it's like, man, I felt like God was giving me a hug. Our feelings are not always a reliable indicator of what is true and what is not. Okay, so I was going to read to you all of this, 12 verses of this psalm, but I just want to make the point that if you look at Psalm 139, 1 through 12, what David does is David says, whether I am on the highest mountaintop of faith or I feel like I'm going through hell on earth, you are there. And then in verse 6 he says, and let me just come to it, he says, such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high, and I cannot attain it. You are there. If I ascend to the heavens, he says, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, if I go down into the depths, behold, you are there. And he says this truth, it's simply too wonderful. I don't even know how to describe it, he says. Basically, I want you to hear this very carefully. I've got to skip through this. My emotional sense of God's presence does not determine God's presence. Right? My ability to feel something in a given moment does not determine whether or not God is actually present with me. And therefore, as Christians, we call our hearts back in faith to the presence of God, regardless of how we feel, knowing that it is through faith, not through an emotional feeling in a moment, that we experience the transformative power of beholding the glory of the Lord and being transformed from one degree of glory into the next. So, last thing here, I love how there's a story from the 1600s about a guy whose name is Nicholas Herman. He's also called Brother Lawrence, but he wrote this book in the 1600s. It's like 50 pages, but the pages are like this big. I mean, it's like a pocket document. It's called Practicing the Presence of God. But he was a guy who was basically like a cook. He worked in the kitchen at some kind of monastery or something in the 1600s. But his goal in life was to live every moment in the awareness of the presence of God. So he was interviewed and talked to by different preachers and different people and all of that. And on his deathbed, they came into him and they talked to him about, what is it like as you're dying? What's your experience? Where are your thoughts at? What's going on? And I just loved the way that he described his last hours and what his heart was doing. I'm going to have to skip a couple of other things. He said, they said, what have you been doing? And he said that he was doing what he would be doing for all eternity, blessing God, praising God, adoring Him, and loving Him with all my heart. That is our whole purpose, brothers, to adore God and to love Him without worrying about the rest. That is the great aim for which we target our hearts, to fix our eyes on Jesus, to gaze upon the glory of the Lord in the face of Christ Jesus, and to practice the presence of God. And it is not something that is easy. It's not something that happens once and it's a one and done type of a thing. Some days we're going to spend but a few moments bringing our hearts into the presence of God. Other days perhaps we spend a lot more. But I just want to encourage you that to apprentice under Jesus is to be in the presence of Jesus. And where we are weak, there is both grace and power. Let me just say that again. Where we are weak, you remember that in 2 Corinthians, Paul's saying, I'm weak, and God's saying, my power is perfected in weakness. My grace is sufficient for you. Those two things are essential ingredients, right? On the one hand, there is grace to cover our weaknesses. On the other, there is spiritual power to grow, to become stronger. And those two things work together in our lives as we look upon Christ. So do not leave today, in other words, miserable over your inadequacy. Instead, learn to live in the joyful presence of God, trusting that there is abundant grace, and yet there's also abundant power that we might live by faith. If you haven't been living by faith in your life, and you want to live in the presence of God, and you want to follow Jesus, you want to be an apprentice of Jesus, you want to be baptized into Christ, I want to offer you the invitation that you might come right now as we stand and sing.